Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for joining me once again. Today, I am extremely excited to have with me Daniel Trevor, a new entrant into the growing cohort of citizen scientists who have been spurred by an impactful life experience to take the deep dive into the rabbit hole of health and popped out the other side with a best-selling book full of shining endorsements from the who's who of this new revolution of doctors and journalists and scientists just realizing that nutrition science up to now is just a bunch of BS. So, without any further ado, Daniel Trevor, thank you so much for joining me today, sir.
Hey, Mr. Ben. Thank you. I really appreciate you having me on. Yeah, that's
So,
a nice introduction there.
yeah, happy to do it, man. So, just to fill the listeners in, I found you about maybe 24 hours or 48 hours ago. I literally just found you on Dr. Philip Ovadia's page. And I've been going through his entire library of episodes because I just am a huge fan of his work. And yours popped out at me. I need to talk to this guy because you have such an interesting story. It's also I had huge shades of Nina Teicholz's story for the Big Fat Surprise, who's another guest I had on. She had a similar story where, she had this life experience of being a vegetarian for her whole life, always having some weight she was having trouble getting off. And I'm sure you heard this because you and her have been in touch. I think it was for a magazine, a publication where she was suddenly tasked with eating all this fatty red meat and butter and eggs for all these meals she was going to review. And she lost a bunch of weight. And she was like, what the heck is going on here? Basically, like, how have I've been punked my whole life. How did this happen? And you
I'm
had a
telling
very
you,
different, yeah, you had a different sort of
wake
intro
up
to
call.
like wake up call. That's a good word
Yeah,
for it. So why don't we just jump straight in with your backstory, how you
yeah,
got
sure.
into this space?
Absolutely. Well, by the way, Dr. Ovadia had me. Dr. Ovadia, of course, as you know, is a cardiologist, and he's also a cardiac surgeon who's done over 3,000 heart operations. So he really knows his stuff, and he came to it to metabolic health and so forth because he was obese and he knew that he was pretty soon destined to arrive on his own operating table. So I had reached out to him and he wrote me a great endorsement for the book. Uh, Nina, too, I reached out to her and she wrote me a great endorsement. So that's just a little bit there. But okay, so my backstory is this. I almost died of a heart attack a few years ago, and it was a complete and total shocker because I was a slim, symptom free Mr. Healthier, so I thought, right? But and then after that happened, I decided that having studied technical data throughout my life, I decided to take a dive into the medical and nutrition science to find out how the hell could this happen to me? I'm Mr. Healthy, right? And what I discovered really blew my mind and shocked and infuriated me, actually. Because what we've been told to eat for decades, especially with the U.S. dietary guidelines, is killing us all. I mean, check out this stat. And this is one of the things that made me do what's called a data evaluation or a data analysis. And in 1930, the obesity rate was 1%. We are now approaching 50%. That's 50x in less than 100 years. Never before in human history has a population gotten so fat and so sick so fast. What the hell is happening? And you pull the strings, and it's the unholy trinity, the carbs, the sugar, the oils. I mean, unholy trinity, as you know, is the name of my book. The subtitle is, and I'll explain all this, of course, in detail. The subtitle is How Carbs, Sugar, and Oils Make Us Fat, Sick, and Addicted, and How to Escape Their Grip. How carbs, sugar, and oils make us fat, sick, and addicted, and how to escape their grip. And I'm saying it'll do it to all of us. That's why I'm not saying first I wrote how carbs, sugar, and oils make you sick. And I thought, no, I'm in that club too, because anybody who's got the wrong or right genetics, or that's not wrong or right, it's just the way they are, you can be influenced by it because our evolutionarily developed bodies that we have, these meat bodies, are used to eating a high fat, low carb diet. I mean, our diet consisted of what we could catch, kill, and eat, nose to tail, and what we might pick off a tree or a vine or something like that, but only when it was in season, right? So we never had all this stuff from the Unholy Trinity. For example, the carbs. And what I mean by that is that's your industrially refined and processed grains, which they then turn into bread, pasta, cereal, crackers, biscuits, waffles, pancakes, chips, pretzels, rolls, pizza, and on that way. And then, of course, the sugar is the candy cake, ice cream, rolls. I mean, not rolls, pastries, and on that way. Soda, which is liquid diabetes, right? And then the oils. It's like they didn't exist until 1865. Talk about evolutionarily inconsistent. We didn't start eating them until about 100 years ago. Canola oil wasn't even invented until 50 years ago. These vegetable seed oils, especially cottonseed oil and soybean oil, they were used as machinery lubricant in the Industrial Revolution. I mean, it's like, what? And somebody looked at a bucket of it and it looked like lard. And they thought, well, hey, let's sell it to people. We could make some money that way. Right. And so and then in 1911, we had these two guys from Europe come to Cleveland. And was it James? I can't remember their first names, but it turned out to be Procter and Gamble. And they created this thing called Crisco. And it started flying off the shelves in 1911. And but it wasn't until 1990 that we discovered that it's just loaded with what's called trans fats, which are the most dangerous fats that anyone can put in their bodies. I mean, even the Mayo Clinic did a study called it was about trans fats being double trouble for the heart. I mean, if that's going to help clog things up, it's going to be that. So the trans fats. But anyway, and they're so closely related to how they make them is they have to use this chemical called hexane. And hexane has been proven to be neurodegenerative. And even in the Journal of Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, they have a study. I mean, the title alone says it all. It says it was like what? Vegetable oils, the true cause of Alzheimer's disease. And it's like, whoa. So you have these the unholy trinity, as I call it. You get carbs, sugar, and oils, and together they are deadly. And for the first time, I think it's like the stat is something like in the last 5 years, lifespans have dropped 4 years. And it keeps accelerating downward. So it's bad news. That's the long answer to your short question.
This is the place for long answers. I love it.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, it's so wild how people have been brainwashed into thinking these things are just genetic. And there have been so many. What's her name? Grace Price is this girl on Twitter. She's like this teenager, high school student who's making a documentary about cancer. Like, what is the true cause of cancer? And she's going on the street, and spoiler alert, the point is that it's the food, unlike what most people think. And she's interviewing people on the street saying, what's the cause of cancer? And everyone's like, oh, it's genetic. It's genetic. It's genetic. And everyone thinks that it's genetic. And they would say the same thing for, like you said, dementia or Alzheimer's or any sort of metabolic disease, Crohn's disease, literally name any disease. And there's a good chance people just assume it's genetic. And if they get it, they're screwed. And there's nothing they can do about it. But there's all this new science coming out and just mountains of anecdotal evidence of people just removing these things from their diet and just magically reversing all of these things just by not eating garbage, just eating fatty red meat and cutting out the carbs.
Absolutely, Ben. You're going to have to send me a link on her. I want to tune in on what she's doing. But on page 1 of chapter 1 of my book, I point out that, a lot of people have this misunderstanding that it's genetics. It's all genetics. But studies have shown that you do have your genetics, and you got to watch, hey, if mom and dad has XYZ, then you've got it too. But only 15 to 25% of your future sickness and everything depends on your genetics. Everything else is up to you. It's your lifestyle. In other words, there's this saying that I don't know who came up with this, but I have it there, and it's genetics loads the gun, but lifestyle pulls the trigger or keeps
I
the
love that.
safety on.
Hmm.
Genetics loads the gun, but it's lifestyle that pulls the trigger or doesn't. You can keep it on safety, or you keep the gun in a vault or whatever because of your lifestyle. If you eat right and you're moving and you do all the right things, these genetics won't touch you. But you always have to keep in mind, one of my big messages in the book, you have to do some testing, especially after the age 30 or 40. You've got to, because if you don't test, it's kind of like driving down the road without a steering wheel or a speedometer. You will crash into something and you're going to go, wow, how did this happen to me? And it's because of the lifestyle. You're going to have to find out. So that's why in the book, I reached out to this guy. His name is Dr. Ford Brewer, brilliant man. I had found him on YouTube, and he's out of Johns Hopkins. He's trained thousands and thousands of doctors over the years and still does. And I asked him to write what turned out to be chapter 22. And what that is what are the most important blood labs and scans that anybody should get to really know what's going on, that the doctors, you will not get it from your typical doctor. And you can ask your doctor for it, but most of the time they'll say, you don't need that. You don't need it. And the only reason they say that is because they don't know about it anyway. They wouldn't know how to interpret it. They never heard of it, and so on. And so you can't depend on your typical doctor. Hey, listen, I don't want to badmouth all of them because let's face it, they save our lives every single day. You know, I mean, they got to set the bone and suture up the wounds and remove bullets and steering wheels from our chests. So they're heroes to me. And if I'm ever in a situation, do your thing, doc. But when it comes to the diseases that are taking over society and why it's causing the lifespan longevity rate to go down instead of up like it was for a long time, they just don't know. And you can't blame them because it's not what they're taught. I mean, for example, when you take your doggy Poochie to the veterinarian, the first question, or one of the first questions the vet, he or she will ask is, so what are you feeding Poochie? When's the last time you ever heard a doctor say, so what's your diet like? It's like,
Never.
forget about it.
They
Forget
say,
about it.
like, do you smoke? No. How much do you exercise?
Yeah,
And that's pretty much
right.
it. And like, whenever they do touch on diet, it's very vague. Like, oh, do you eat healthy? Like, or do you have plenty of fruits and vegetables and whole grains, which isn't even the right advice in general. So
Yeah.
in every single one of the doctors that I've been looking into, Dr. Ovadia included, Dr. Ken Berry, Dr. Anthony Chafee, all these guys that we know are really dialed in. They will vouch for this, that during their own med school training, they got like a couple hours of nutrition throughout several years of school. That was it. Like it's so suspiciously left out that it's impossible
That's
to
the key
not get
word.
conspiratorial about this. Like, why would this entire academic curriculum, which is built by the pharma industry, they're funded by that, why would they not want people to understand, or the doctors to understand, that nutrition is the baseline of health? It's so odd.
Well,
Kind of makes you ask some questions.
I don't have, the key psychos that run the planet. I don't get calls from them to filling me in on what they're up to. But I do know I have been able to connect some dots, and I have that in chapter 12. You know, these guys from the World Health Organization and the WHO, first of all, they consider that there's way too many people on this planet. First of all, it's a wildly underpopulated because most of it is wasteland, right? What is the stat I saw? It was like you could put the entire population of the planet into a small number of square miles, shoulder to shoulder. I mean, it's mostly wasteland and that kind of thing. And they have ulterior motives for that. So they are up to thinning the herd and lowering the population of the ant farm because that's all they consider us. So coming from that, I mean, their stated, what is it? Ideal global population is 500,000. So they've got a ways to go. So I don't know, you could start connecting some dots, or even at least thinking, hey, are we purposely being overfed and undernourished? And do they want us fat, sick, and addicted, and undernourished and overfed and over psych drugged and over medicated? Because as you correctly point out, the suspicious is that, well, okay, so since the big pharma funds the medical schools, and it would be to their advantage that doctors reach for the prescription pad first before they talk about what's your diet like. It starts to make the key word you used there makes you suspicious. And especially when you see a lot of the doctors with these bellies and everything too, and they don't know anything, and they really don't get any education on nutrition. They don't look at anything anthropological or evolutionarily consistent, because again, these bodies for hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years, we're used to eating a high fat, low carb diet. And then we get hit with these bunch of lies from this guy in the 50s, what's his name? Ansel Keys, who came up with this diet heart hypothesis BS that said it was the saturated fat in meat, butter, cheese, and everything that was clogging up the arteries and everything. And it's not that at all, because it doesn't work that way. I mean, he got this idea into people's heads where it was kind of like a shower drain that clogs up with the soap and the grease and the hair and the gook. And it's not like that at all, because the plaque builds up beneath the artery walls, where it can then cause heart attacks and strokes. He had it totally wrong. But that's the direction they took back then. And people get that idea in their minds. And there's a quote that I just remembered from Mark Twain, who was a brilliant man. And he was the king of common sense. And he said, let's see, what was it? I'll say it twice so it sinks in. It's easier to fool people than to convince them they have been fooled. It's easier to fool people than to convince them they have been fooled. I mean, because once people get that, shower drain thing in their mind, oh, well, that must be it. And then his so-called science, was completely disproven over the years with many, many studies, but it still lingers to this day, because so many billions of dollars are being made selling these things called statins. And I have a whole chapter on that too, chapter 18. I take a deep dive into a lot of this stuff. And the cardiovascular section is chapter 17, 18, 19, 20, where I really go into the statins and the stents and the cabbage. Cabbage is CABG, that stands for coronary artery bypass graft. That's basically open heart surgery and I actually consulted with Dr. Ovadia on that too. And he gave me a couple of tips, but it was just, see, here's the deal with that. Just so if I could just go sidetrack briefly on that. There was a big study called the ischemia trial, and it involved, this was a big federally funded $100 million study, right? And it was almost 5,200 people, and they divided them into two groups. It was a randomized control trial, excellent science, right? And two groups. Group one, got invasive procedures like cabbage, which is the open heart surgery, or PCI. PCI is percutaneous coronary intervention. That's just a fancy medical term for a stent. The stent is, something they put in to open up the artery. And so they followed both groups closely for 4 years, and they wanted to prove that these invasive procedures were really the way to go to prevent heart disease and heart attacks and prolong life. And after 4 years, it failed. There was no difference. Oh, I'm sorry. The other group, let me tell you the other group. The other group was lifestyle changes, changing your diet, losing 20 pounds, getting to the gym, maybe some blood pressure medications, that kind of thing. So you had group one, which is the invasive procedures, and group two was just lifestyle mainly, and that kind of thing. And there was no difference after 4 years. And they even said the ischemia trial failed to show that these invasive procedures could help prevent, because there was just as many events, in other words, heart attacks, strokes, deaths, and so in both groups. And it was a complete failure. And then there was another one, similar big study. It was called the Ovadia trial. And then there was another one called the Courage trial. Same kind of thing. They failed to show that they made any difference. Now, to be clear, these invasive procedures can be life-saving procedures, but only in 15% of the time. When people are having a heart attack or they're going through some emergency that they've shown up in the ER with, they can be. But the other 85% of the time, they don't do it. They don't prevent. I mean, the headline from it was, and this truly shocked the medical world. The headline was that bypass surgery and stents do not prevent heart attacks and strokes and deaths. They do not do that. It's only in the 15% of the time where there's an emergency situation. And thank God that we have that, right? So anyway, so then I ask in the book, I say, well, do you think, now that we've proven that, do you think these invasive procedures will now come to a halt, except for emergency situations? And I answer with something like, there is such an enormous amount of revenue generated from these mostly unnecessary procedures that there's no way in hell that the CEOs and the board of directors of hospitals and cardiology clinics are going to see that disappear. Because if you do that, then careers and institutions will disappear, because, and if that happens, there goes the mountain retreat and maybe the beach house, and the kids are no longer in Ivy League. They're at the community college, and they can't attend the golf club or the country club, and they got to change their lifestyle because, what's his name? Cardiologist, Dr. William Davis even said, I used to do these stents all the time. I'd made like $2,000 for every one. I would do 10 a day. I mean, they're making a fortune on these stents and bypassing. And so you can imagine how much money they would see disappear. And you would think at least it would not get any higher in rating insofar as the amount of these procedures that are being done. But it's being done more than ever. The stats on them are going way up like this. So anyway, it's better to find out what's going on inside you before you have a heart attack or stroke than to have to go through that. Because look, my biggest regret is having to have this life-threatening event to place me on this path. And I was one of the lucky ones that survived, right? Check out this stat. A lot of people don't survive their first heart attack, right? And over 50% of those who die of their first heart attack, their very first symptom of heart disease was their own death. I mean, don't expect any clouds before the storm. It's just bang, there you are. And it's just wild. So
there you are, anyway. And there you go. See you later.
Yeah.
That's crazy.
So then you find yourself 20 feet above your most recent body, looking down, going, "Hey, what the hell just happened?"
I'm really glad that you bring all that up, because as I've been going through these testimonials, that's what I've been doing the last several months, just listening to all these testimonials of people like yourself who switched to a high-fat diet away from the standard high-carb diet and just see a huge improvement in their health. And one of the most common stories I hear in terms of like people just scorned by the medical system is that they can tell that every time they go to the doctor, they're just being sort of funneled into some sort of either very intense drug or some medical procedure, often which is permanent. And people are really starting to realize, like, wait a minute, after they change their diet, all their problems are being solved naturally. And they didn't need to do those invasive procedures or take those drugs that did crazy things to their body. Something as simple as like Accutane. Like I used to take Accutane for my acne, and now I think I only had acne because I was drinking like soy milk and having Cheerios every morning, most likely. Like that was terrible for me. And pizza for lunch, I had a really high carb diet. I'll bet if I would have just cut the seed oils and carbs out, I wouldn't have needed that. And you see just so many kids these days with the same issue. All these kids have acne. That's like a perfect sign that your diet is just not very good. But none of them will go to the dermatologist and be told to just eat a cleaner diet and eat more meat. They'll all be told, oh, you need to take some drug or you need to rub cream all over your face for the rest of your life. It's like these weird topical ideas that aren't even solutions. And it's it's really crazy. It goes from no matter what age you are, whatever problem you're having, that's always a similar theme. And that said, though, one of the other things I wanted to point out that you also brought up is that there's a difference between acute injuries and chronic pain when it comes to how much I trust the medical system. If I were to break my arm today, there's no other time I'd rather be around it right now going to a modern hospital because they have the
Sure.
technology that has improved so much to be able to handle that. However, for a chronic problem like, you know, name the whole list, things that are like, quoted diseases, this is the worst time ever to have that because you're never going to get a holistic solution as you would have a long time ago when people just said like eat more meat, or they didn't even have these diseases 10 years ago because people were just eating meat and not getting all these carbs and seed oils in their bodies.
Yeah, that's true. I discussed this a lot of this with my older daughter Chloe, who she's a PA in the ER, and she's always, besides saving lives with like I said, healing up the stab wounds and all that kind of stuff. She's also seeing all the results of the Unholy Trinity that come in there too. And the big thing is that there's no education on any of this. There's not in the schools, and parents, and they just look at the doctors. That I guess they get blind with that white jacket that they have on, and think they must know it all when they get so little to nothing of education about how these bodies should be eating. It's like the vet knows. What are you feeding Poochie? He's not going to ask you what's the diet like and that kind of thing. And that's why I've written the book for the average reader of health and wellness. I mean, I have a ton of science in there. And I say in the beginning, near the beginning, right after the introduction, I have a page called Important Note where I cover a couple of important things, just one page long. And I say, you might be thinking, why should I trust you? You don't have formal university medical credentials and organic chemistry and all this kind of thing. Excuse me. And I tell them, don't. Just think of me as a friendly relay point of what the best and most modern 21st century science has to offer for your health and longevity. Trust that and fix yourself. I did. None of this is my opinion. This is not Daniel's opinion. This is what I discovered. All of the most modern science, the correct science, randomized controlled trials, meta-analyses, and so forth. And I ignored anything that had funding from big food, big medicine, or big pharma, that kind of thing. And so I just say, trust that and fix yourself. I did, and you can too. So again, none of it's my opinion, and I wrote it. I wrote it for the average reader of health and wellness in a clear and friendly manner, so that they could understand it. I mean, I wrote it for Uncle Bill or somebody who's not technically oriented. I mean, I'll give the studies. I'll say, hey, look, they had this many thousand of people and they divided them into two groups and they did this and this. And over a period of years, this is what the results show. So take your guidance from that. Eventually they found out that smoking was, really, really and truly causative of a lot of disease. So through different studies. So you have to test. Yeah, that's the main thing. You got to test, not guess.
And this is the disruption from the outsiders that I think is so necessary because, in the same way that Nina Teicholz with her book, The Big Fat Surprise, became legendary, and all the best doctors in the world started reading this, saying like, "Wow, this is more than I ever learned through all of my med school." And all the doctors are now becoming the biggest proponents for these books because they're sort of within that system and they're starving for actual information that will help their patients. Because Well, I'm sure we can both agree that like the vast majority of doctors that go through med school and become practitioners, they want to help people. They are very good-hearted people. They want to help their patients. They just have been given a lot of incorrect information. And with that said, I'd love to sort of transition here actually on
Sure.
the actual Unholy Trinity, because this is the title of your book. I'd like to dive into each one at a time because I think that this is important for people to really understand. So, is there anything else you wanted to cover real quick before that?
No, just that you're so right. They're well intentioned, but I have a thing. Dr. Ovadia, our cardiologist friend, he he had me on his podcast sometime last month. I can't remember, and we were going over. He asked me this question that was because he knew I had a technical background and that kind of thing. But he said to me, he said, "How is it that you, as a non-physician, were able to figure this all out when 99% of medical doctors can't or won't?" I'm thinking, wow, what a question. So we explored that. And one of the things, I mean, he had his opinions on certain things. And I think that sometimes you have the mentality goes like this. It's, well, if they didn't teach it to me in medical school, it must not be that important. I don't know. I mean, that seems plausible to me, right? If it was important enough, they would have taught it to me in medical school. But I'm taught to reach for the prescription pad instead. And so it's drugs and procedures and drugs and procedures and more drugs and more procedures instead of what is the patient eating? What are they, what are their genetics? What should they not be eating and so forth and that kind of thing. So anyway, I wanted to respond with that. And also, well, with the carbohydrates, for example, I had a high carb diet. That was my downfall. I was totally sold on the propaganda and the bullshit of heart healthy whole grains.
Same.
And in the morning I'd have this granola that had tons of carbohydrates and high fructose corn syrup and all these other things that were deadly. And I didn't know. I thought, heart healthy whole grains, and grains weren't even in the human diet until about 9,000 years ago. I mean, and that's like a snap of the finger in the eons of time, right? So our bodies are just not used to it. And little backstory on the history. In 1955, there was a big scare. All men were being taken in the prime of their life, heart attacks. President Eisenhower at the time had a heart attack. It was like, what is going on? And this is when this Ansel Keys got his idea. Oh, it's the fat and saturated fat and all that. It
People
turns
were
out that it
desperate
was,
for an answer, so they would really cling on to anything at that point.
yes. Well, it turned
Hmm.
out they found out 20 years later in the 80s, 70s, 80s, that it was due to the epidemic of smoking. Smoking, because here's the deal with that. And I have this, I think that's even in chapter 1. Smoking destroys what's called the glycocalyx. The glycocalyx is the fuzz-like protection that you have that is around the artery walls, the endothelial, as they call it. It's this fuzz-like protection. It's the first line of protection against what's called small, dense LDL particles to invade the artery that get in there and they stick and they build up plaque over time. And the plaque is what happens when you have a heart attack. It ruptures through. But anyway, it was smoking. But what turns out is that there's a much more deadly and more destructive thing to the glycocalyx that gets destroyed, and that is the carbohydrates from grains and sugars. And I didn't know any of this. I thought heart healthy whole grains. I didn't know that they turn into sugar in the body. I mean, I would avoid, eating candy bars and stuff like that, or I wasn't drinking Coca-Cola or anything like that. But, I was addicted to these high carb whole grains. And the grains, that's a whole other story. But anyway, that's the carbohydrates is mostly that. You get carbohydrates from sugar too. So you get the carbohydrates. It's mostly from the grains, which are, again, they turn these processed grains into powders that they then make bread and pasta and cereal and waffles and all the things that people get addicted to. Why are they getting addicted to it? Because in the 60s and 70s, Big Ag, they came up with this way of processing the grains. See, up until that point, grains grew to shoulder length height, or not shoulder length, but shoulder height. And after that, they reduced it. They wanted to get a bigger crop, and they figured that if they reduce, it's now 18 inches tall instead of shoulder height. And what they did to it is called semi-dwarf wheat. And what they did was they get a better crop yield from doing that. But what they did was they have this thing called chemical mutagenesis and radiation mutagenesis, and that amps up this chemical called gliadin, Gliadin, gliadin. What does that do? That attaches to the opiate receptors in our brains. It doesn't get you high or relieve pain, but what it does do, it makes you crave more of the things that have grains in them, like the bread, the pasta, the cereal, the crackers, the waffles, and so on and so forth. And that's why, if you notice, you eat a big pasta meal or some other kind of thing, you're hungry in an hour. Because see, these carbohydrates, they don't satisfy appetite. They stimulate it. And that's why you have to avoid those. So get your carbohydrates elsewhere. And
Yeah,
then go ahead.
yeah, everyone understands, and that's why people who are on high carb diets and bought into the low fat narrative, which so many of us did for most of our life. I mean, I still
That was me.
remember
That was me.
all of us. Yeah, like, and you were mentioning how you really viewed it as a healthy food. I can absolutely remember when I believed that, like, the white Wonder Bread, that's bad, but the dark colored, like, super seedy filled bread, that's good. And
Yeah.
those are different.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's like a great marketing. Like, it has all these little stats on the wrapper, like, oh, it's got this many grains, it's whole wheat, it's great for your heart, and all these things. And all those things, your body doesn't know any of those things. Your body just, like, breaks it down into sugar in your body. It all breaks down to the same
Exactly.
thing. Every
And
single plant, whether it's wheat or fruits or vegetables, it all just breaks down to sugar.
it's true. And I have a chapter, was it chapter 10? It's called Are You a Wheat Addict? And I go into the whole history of and how we never ate them before in our hundreds of thousands and millions of years as humanoids. And, I've already told you about the addictive qualities that they have because of this amping up of this thing called gliadin that stimulates the opiate receptors in the brain. But also I give the history. In the book, I have a lot of graphs and charts and pictures and that kind of thing to make it easier for the reader to understand. And I have this picture near the beginning of that chapter. It's of this human skull, this fellow who's 100,000 years old. Well, the skull is, right? And he has perfect teeth, just absolutely perfect. And I ask, do you think he had dental floss, an orthodontist, brush 3 times a day? No, it was none of that. What happened was after they exhumed bodies from after 9,000 years ago, when we started eating, towards the present, so when we started, everything changed. It was all these new diseases started to come in, not like in the last 100 years. It's like that's unprecedented. Tooth decay, missing teeth, men shrunk 5 inches, women shrunk 3 inches. It was a disaster. The bones started. It was
The
just
brain shrunk too, I think. Everything shrunk.
it was
Mm-hmm.
just a disaster. And because when animals were not available, clever humans found that if they ground up the seeds of these plants and heated them, they could make something like a porridge, and that allowed them to survive another day, week, month. But it took a serious toll on their health until they could find animals again and kill them and eat them. And that was their primary diet forever. I mean, in the past. And so that's kind of the history of it there. I have all of it in that chapter 10, but I wanted to throw that into. But these human bodies are just not used to eating those grains. And it's very new because there's this other scientific thing called, I think it's called the adaptation hypothesis, where species of various animals, including humans, get used to, when they're used to eating a certain way for a long time, they're used to that. You know, it's really funny. I was on Dr. Ken Berry's podcast a few weeks ago. An example he gave, because he has a farm now. He says, "Yeah, Daniel, that's right. If somebody said to me, 'Hey, you've got your 70 sheep you have there, they eat all the grass and everything,' he says, 'You know, you should eat this new cereal that we came up for them, because we made it in a factory and it's so much better and it's processed.'" And he said, anybody would look at you and go, "What are you, crazy?" That is so weird. And it's the same thing with these human bodies. They're just not made for that kind of thing. And all of these things are evolutionarily inconsistent.
And it's important for people to understand. It's so easy for us to get caught in this idea that like only the last 100 years have been bad, and we can agree that the last 100 years have been the worst. We've been just going completely off the rails to a whole new level. But it's
Oh yeah.
really been it's been 10,000 years of a steady decline. And that goes right back to I mean, what was it, 9,000, 12,000, around 10,000 years was when the agricultural revolution began, and humans started to decide that we're going to start eating plants now. Because before that, it was pretty much all meat, and like the occasional berry that was like starvation food. You know, if you literally couldn't get anything else, you would, and like you were saying, that would take a toll on their body, because these weren't these super highly palatable, detoxified, like hybridized versions of fruit that we have today. These
Yeah.
were like things that would poison you, but get you just enough nutrients to not die. And now, 10,000 years later, you know, these thousands of years of the farming just selectively breeding these fruits and vegetables to be more and more tasty and crunchy and huge and unpoisonous. They're basically trying to squeeze the poison out of them so they don't kill us like they used to. And but they still have poison. They still have these defense chemicals in them. For like, there's no way you can get that completely out, because a plant is going to have defense chemicals, and that goes for all plants. It goes for everything from the wheat to the fruits to the vegetables to the sugars. Um, all of these things contain these things that are terrible for people. And the one of the things that brought that up to my attention was, and you were talking about how all these diseases started popping up, was the ancient Egyptians. I think I haven't done a ton of research on this, but I do know that Egyptians had like a lot of disease, and you could see like in the mummification and the hieroglyphics that people were yeah, they were just having a rough time. Like they were having a lot of disease and dying really young age. And this is where a lot of these stories that people bring up, like, oh, in the old days people died younger. But yes, it's not, they have the timeline off. It's not they're not looking far back enough to when we were just eating meat. They're looking a few thousand years ago to when we were actually eating grains still. And grains were the problem. Because like that was exactly what people ate in Egypt during that time. Like during that whole period, they gave the peasants lots of grains, and the peasants throughout history have been the just fed grains and grains and grains and plants, while the masters ate all the meat. And you know, even like the
No, it's
pirates
so
on the
true.
pirate ships, you know, the pirates that were in the seamen on the ships were being fed only bread, so they were all getting scurvy. And now that's another one where people completely take that out of context now, and they say, oh, like meat eaters are going to get scurvy because they get no vitamin C. No, the masters on the ships were eating the meat. They did not get scurvy. It was just the seamen who were eating bread the whole time. They weren't eating meat. They're the ones that got the scurvy because they weren't getting the vitamin C. It's crazy how much nonsense
True.
there is.
Throughout recorded history, uh, plant-based diets were reserved for slaves, prisoners, and foot soldiers. The Romans marched on barley. The elites had all they want. So why is it that the elites of the planet are pushing plant-based diets? Uh, and why do they want us to eat grasshoppers instead of the meat? Well, I get into a whole thing on that in chapter 12. Uh, I don't want to get into a whole political thing here, but that's, World Economic Forum with Klaus Schwab. He's the guy who famously said, in the future, you will own nothing, but you will be happy. Like, oh, hey, thanks, Klaus. What a nice slave master, right? And they want us to eat the bugs too. But because again, they view the planet as overcrowded. Their stated ideal population is 500,000. So they have a lot of weaning of the herd that needs to take place. And I know that sounds conspiratorial, but believe what you will. But that's what I see. I have my
Meanwhile,
eyes.
they're like Bill Gates is buying up the most farmland of anyone on Earth. Like they're taking all the farm for themselves. So who knows why that could be? I don't know.
Well, he and others have big investments in lab grown meats and so forth, right? So yeah, that's pretty crazy stuff. So read my chapter 12. I think you'll like it.
Yep, yep. All right, so that's a good overview on wheat. What should we do next? How about seed oils? That's a fun one. I want to talk about.
Wow.
And by the way, I'm not sure if you knew this, but I learned while researching for one of my older interviews that Nina Teicholz is the one that came up with the term seed oils. Did you know that?
Yeah, no, it's
She came up
true.
with
Yeah,
that. That's so awesome.
I got to know her and know her. I mean, over email and everything because she wrote me a wonderful endorsement for the book. But yeah, her book has made, and I quote her a couple of times in my book. And yeah, she was the one that pointed out a lot of that. She was at the vanguard of the whole vegetable seed oils. I mean, I have a chapter 6. It's called "The Shocking Truth About Vegetable Oils." And I go into the whole history there with these two guys, Procter and Gamble, and Crisco, and how they were basically machinery lubricant that were considered toxic waste. And then she shed a light on it. And also they put all these vegetable oils into just about every packaged food you can imagine. If you go into most people's pantry, you just look at all the cookies and the thing and everything, and they've got either, soybean oil or canola. And this is even in your mayonnaise and your salad dressings. They're putting it in everything. And fast food is just loaded with it. And so it also contributes to heart disease. Interestingly, see, in 1900, the biggest killers were infectious diseases like tuberculosis, influenza, that kind of thing. And by 1955, it was heart disease and cancer. And the very first officially medically recorded heart attack wasn't until 1912. And that's where you started having all of these things. You got the smoking, you got the seed oils, and so on. So yeah, she was at the forefront of that. Also, who is there's a guy now, a Dr. Chris Kenobi, and he's got a wonderful book called The Ancestral Diet Revolution. And he's really at the vanguard too of the seed oils, the vegetable seed oils, and so forth. Now, to be clear, there are some that are okay for you, like true, authentic virgin olive oil, avocado oil, and coconut oil, that kind of thing. So those are safe to cook with. But the others, what happens is the more you heat them, and when you repeatedly heat them, like they do in fast foods or any kind of restaurant, I don't know, high end, middle of the road, or fast food, the more trans fats gets created. Even though the FDA had outlawed and banned trans fats to be added into any foods, what happens is, and that was like in 2015, they gave the food manufacturers 3 years to get it out. And they did that. But what happens is when you take some of these and and even though it's been removed, when you reheat them, like they do with French fries and, all the different things that they cook with, it raises the trans fat sky high. And so I'm sure that had something to do with mine too, because I wasn't paying attention. I wasn't a ingredients reader of the labels, right? So I was, and so all these things, I go into the whole history of that in that chapter and how they came about and how they get promoted, because these liquids, um, they bake them so that they become more palatable, and they can spread them. They can make margarine and this and that kind of thing. And it gets into the bodies, and it's really very bad news. All the different diseases. There's about 8 different cancers. This was just in the World Cancer Forum that was like 2 or 3 years ago, and they were relating it to breast cancer. I can't remember all 7 or 8 of them, but they were saying that how these seed oils were directly related to it. And so, it's all about education. And that's why I say in my book, I try to write it all in an unscientific way to say, look, this is the deal. This is what happened to me. This is because, don't be like me, because I was ignorant of everything. Do some tests and find out what's going on inside you before it's too late.
Right. And just to make sure that people heard you clearly in that beginning part there, because I feel like this is the craziest part of all, is that this was machine lubricants used on like engines.
Yes.
And they decided, how can we make some more money on this? Maybe we
that
could
was
feed
in the
it to humans.
late 1900s and late 1800s and early 1900s. That was the Industrial Revolution period. And that's what they used them for, because they ran out of whale lubricant or whale grease,
blubber,
whale fat.
Right?
Yeah. And so they got this. And again, Dr. Chris Kenobi, in his book, he gives a lot of the history there, that these weren't even invented until 1865. And they invented them to take the place of the whale blubber and the grease, because they needed to lubricate these machines. And cotton was being created, and they viewed this cottonseed oil as a toxic waste. Then it turned out to be a food product, because, hey, let's sell it to people. You can thank Procter & Gamble for that.
It's the craziest story ever.
Yeah, it's toxic. That's why I have that chapter, and it's called The Shocking Truth About Vegetable Oils, that everybody needs to find out about. That it's that chapter alone still blows my mind with the research I did on that, because you have to remember, my book has more scientific references and citations than any other book on the market, any other health and wellness. Most of them have maybe 200 or 300. I have 1,227. I knew I needed that backup to say, hey, look, this is not Daniel's opinion. This is what the science says, and here they are.
Because we're dummies. We don't have an MD after our name, so we need to do a little extra work to get our credibility.
People need to.
I don't know if it should be that way, because we all know how bad the medical schools are.
You can't think that way. I'm telling to anybody, to not only you, but your audience, you can't think that way. That the doctor's brilliant at certain things that can fix you right away. But these other things with nutrition and diabetes, and, most of the population has some degree of a diabetic physiology. They have some level of type 2 diabetes, and they don't know it because there's no symptoms. That was me. I was a raging type 2 diabetic, and I didn't know it because there's no symptoms.
And you were pretty slim, right? You looked fairly healthy, didn't you?
Yeah, there's about 2 or 3% of the population that can be on the lean side, but still be type 2 diabetic. Most are overweight or obese, one or the other. And the reason why, there's 2 studies. One was in 2019, and it was a 7-year study, and they found that 12%, only 12% of the population is metabolically healthy. That means the other 88% are not. A couple years later,
that's the world, right? Not the U.S. That's the whole world.
Well, this is no. This is the United States.
The U.S. Okay.
Let me just limit to there. Yeah, we're winning this race. The race in obesity and everything else, right? We are winning that. And then a couple years later, in 2022, there was another study done by Journal of the American College of Cardiology, which is the top place on the planet for cardiology and so forth. And they discovered that it's now down to only 6.8% of the population is metabolically healthy. That means the other 92.3 are unmetabolically healthy. And so you have to do these tests because, see, here's the danger. And I was talking to Dr. Ford Brewer about this on his podcast a little while back about how this is an epidemic. And it's a silent epidemic of diabetic physiology. And that's because most doctors, well, here's another study. In 2019, which is just, that's like 10 minutes ago in the medical field because it takes so long to get to the front lines of the doctors and everything. They found that they did a big survey of doctors. They found that 74% of doctors, now this is cardiologists, internists, and general practitioners, 74% do not know how to properly, and this is out of Johns Hopkins, they do not know how to properly diagnose pre-diabetes or type 2 diabetes, let alone know how to treat it. All they do is they will test for fasting blood glucose and A1C, one or the other. And then you could, because you can have a normal reading, like I had a normal reading on both of those things. But when you do this other test, which I'll tell you about in a second, you're going to find out the truth where you are, because you can have a normal reading on your fasting blood glucose and A1C and be a raging type 2 diabetic. And that was me. There's this test I cover in chapter 7, and I call it the most important health test you've never had. The reason for that is because all of the silent major diseases come from having some degree of a diabetic physiology. Your heart attacks, your strokes, your certain cancers,
Alzheimer's and dementia. Those are like considered like
Alzheimer's and
type 3 diabetes. Yeah.
Exactly. Amputations from diabetic neuropathy, polycystic ovarian syndrome, which I have a whole chapter on that too. All these silent diseases are from having some degree of diabetes. That's because you can't have heart disease without having some level of diabetes. And that was proven. The science is clear on that. So anyway, the test that I'm talking about is called the OGTT with insulin, oral glucose tolerance test with insulin. OGTT with insulin. All this is in the book because like I said, I had Dr. Ford Brewer write chapter 22. And that contains what are all the most important blood labs and scans you can get. And so this one is the one that will tell you whether you're pre-diabetic or where you are in the diabetic spectrum, pre-diabetic, or you're already full-blown type 2 diabetic. And it could be the reason why you have XYZ disease and you don't know it. And that's why you have to find that out. You got to do that test, and doctors don't check it. They just usually check your A1C on your metabolic panel, and they go, "Hey, you're good. You're normal. I'll see you in a year." That's not good. You got to do this. So all the tests are in the book, and I urge people, look, I got to tell you, you don't get wealthy selling health books, but I have become extremely wealthy when I hear back from people, because the book's only been out a couple of months, right? All over the planet, they're contacting me and saying, "Wow, this is amazing. You're changing my life." And I'm thinking, now that's why I wrote the book, because, if I can help my brother and sister humanoids avoid what I went through, that's going to make me happy. So you got to test. And like Dr. Ford calls his chapter 22, don't guess, test.
Or if you're just a crazy weirdo like me, you can just stop eating everything that turns into sugar and just only eat red meat every day and not have to worry about it. I had a couple of big steaks for breakfast today, and I'm feeling quite good about not getting diabetes because I'm not spiking my blood sugar ever.
Yeah, no. Hey, listen, and not to scare anybody off, but there are some people, depending on your genetics, that can tolerate a little bit of carbs. I don't promote a zero carb. Some people are great with that. They're fine with that. And sometimes people will go full carnivore. They get rid of all their diseases, and then they'll go back and include a little, this or that here and there. Not a lot, because these bodies weren't used to a lot. Again, these bodies were used to, evolutionarily speaking, a high-fat, low-carb diet. So there you go.
Yeah, and
Like I
don't know
can
if you
get away
followed.
with. I can get away with eating a little asparagus, that kind of thing, but but I just keep an eye on, you have to do the testing. It's great to get a CGM, continuous glucose monitor. That way, it depends on how serious you need to be in order to change the state that you find yourself in, that you've discovered through the testing that you're going to do.
Totally. And when I listened to your interview with Ken Berry, I remember he sort of brought that up because he is full carnivore as well. And it really just comes down to, just understanding that your anchor should be 100% red meat, in my opinion, just like all fat and protein and zero carbs. Because I don't know if you followed Bart K at all, Professor Bart K on YouTube. He's awesome. He's one of my favorite carnivore voices out there.
He is brilliant. That guy is
Yes.
he's a very smart guy. I could do without some of the. He's ruthless
Toxicity.
and he's kind of
Oh, I
mean.
love the ruthlessness. I love it. I want more of that.
The way
it depends on. See, like Ken Berry and him are like great examples of two very different styles. Bart K he just goes all guns blazing after people that are saying things are incorrect, and the thing he keeps coming back to is the optimal amount of carbohydrates is not 1 gram ever, zero. And he just keeps coming back to that, and he even says, and this is it sounds like sort of similar boat to you, like it's not going to kill you to have an apple every once in a while, or a piece of candy, or a cucumber, or whatever you want to choose to be your sugar. But don't go on the internet and tell people it's good for you, because it's not. It just breaks down to sugar. It's going to spike your blood sugar. It's going to increase your risk for those problems later in life. And that's what Bar K is all about.
Yeah, no. It's just, I'm not big on ridicule, no matter how off base the person is. I don't know. It's just me. But anyway, yeah, he is a very brilliant guy, this guy Bart K. So I'm down with his science.
It's definitely to each their own. Everyone has a different style of sort of teaching, I guess we'll call it educational philosophy. If you're looking for someone who's very chill and relaxed, Ken Berry is a great option. If you're looking for someone who's kind of in the middle, I would say Anthony Chafee, Dr. Anthony Chafee. He's definitely facts first, but he'll come after you if you say some bullshit. And then there's Bart K, he's going to make a whole hour-long video about how wrong you are if you say anything about carbs. And that's my favorite personally. Everyone's different. I love Bart K like almost the most, because I feel like that he's like our inner line inside of us is just so angry at this misinformation is constantly pushed out, and I just want to just see it destroyed. It just makes me feel better.
You are one of those people that were in the gladiator days. Yeah, whip him, kill him.
Only if you're telling people to eat carbs.
I'm a little less. I don't go for slapping them around so much. I just say, okay, so because look, a lot of these people, they're well-meaning. I mean, I tried being a vegetarian, and all the vegans and vegetarians that I've ever known were all well-meaning people, and they were way ahead of most people in trying to improve their health and trying to get better and that kind of thing. They are just miseducated. That's all. They've just got wrong information that they've bought into. And it's back to Mark Twain's quote. What did he say? It was, it's easier to fool people than to convince them they have been fooled. So it's sometimes it's difficult because they get these certain, and then people get locked into it. There's another brilliant quote. I have some of these quotes in the book. There's this late, great Richard Feynman. He won the Nobel Prize for quantum physics. Brilliant guy. And he has this quote. And again, I'll say it twice to let it sink in. I would rather have questions that can't be answered than answers that can't be questioned. I would rather have questions that can't be answered than answers that can't be questioned, because, you have these people with the crazed with the climate stuff, and, they just, his quote says it all. Look, you can't ever shut science off. You always have to leave it open for question, everything.
And that's what the
especially
internet
from,
is doing. It's giving people like, you and me and Ken Berry the opportunity to just put these new ideas out there and just let the public test things out and decide. And
yeah,
anyone who, if you go to any one of Dr. Ken Berry's YouTube videos and just scroll through the comment section, it's just packed with people saying, wow, I tried this and it worked for me and I feel great. And so you get a real time feedback of like what's actually happening, and you can cut straight through the noise of these narratives you've been fed your whole life by like listening to real people and just being inspired to try things yourself. Cause like you said, don't, what was it? Test. I forgot the,
no, don't guess,
don't
test.
guess, test. Yes.
Yeah,
Test
that's
things
chapter
on yourself.
22
Give,
because
give
that's how I
yourself these
discovered everything.
experiments.
That's how I
And
discovered that all my things. I was found out that I was type after I had the heart attack. I get a lot of tests because I found out um, about a lot of things that I should check out because I wanted to have a benchmark of where I could measure my progress. 6 months down the line and so forth. And so I got all these tests done, and that's how I discovered that the cause of my cardiovascular disease was being a type 2 diabetic. And it was also the cause of my um, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease because I don't drink or do drugs. I'm already silly enough, as my daughters will surely attest. And so, I had this fatty liver disease, and then it turns out I had osteoporosis as well. And there's no symptoms or any of this thing. So, with my all my research that I did in this how-to book that I wrote, I was able to reverse all four of those things, and
awesome.
that's what I want to share with the people. And because they may have something different than I do that needs to be corrected, but the most likely thing they're going to find out is they're an undiagnosed type 2 diabetic. Believe me, it's there. It's the biggest epidemic, silent epidemic, much bigger than what we just went through in this nonsense the last few years. So you have to don't gas test is the message. Don't be like me. Because again, my biggest regret is having to have this life-threatening event to place me on this path, and I was one of the lucky ones survived. Because don't wait for symptoms. That's what I always thought. I thought, well, there will be at least be some clouds before a storm, right? No, there are none, and so by the time you get symptoms, you are way down the line, and it's a long road back, or it's just too late.
Yeah, and no matter what age you are, this is so important to think about. And I forgot to ask, are you in your 70s? Is that correct?
I am 75.
75. And so it was early 70s you had this heart attack, and I'm 29. So I'm in my late 20s, about to get into my 30s. And I really encourage everyone that's listening, no matter what age you are, you could be a teenager. It's never too early to start thinking about these things and improve your health, because it's just going to make the rest of your life so much smoother and better. You're going to live happier and longer. And
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
just
Well,
because this is a heart attack that spurred this journey for Daniel here doesn't mean that you shouldn't take steps immediately if you want to have the best life possible.
the biggest reason why I was able to push it off so long and not have this earlier, because this runs in my family big time. I do have the genetics, right? Mom and dad both had the cardiovascular disease. And looking back at their bodies and their diets, I know that they were type 2 diabetic as well. But the thing is that I was able to push off having it for so long because I used to work out. I would get to the gym or I would jog, and I always go to the gym. My chapter 9 has a lot of information about aging and muscle, how muscle is the organ of longevity. And if you can have that, there's a lot of really good information about how that can push off all of these or make you avoid or hold off, at least for the time being, all of these things that would have attacked you in your 40s and 50s. And so because I was hitting the gym a few times a week or more, that's what pushed it off for me. But anyway, you've got to do all that testing and to really find out. And the heavier you are, the sooner you should get those tests. So, like that.
And
But
that
yeah,
was
so
definitely me for most of my life. And I think a lot of people too, they just think, oh, I'll just hit the gym extra hard tomorrow. I'm just going to drink this 12 pack with the bros and smoke a bong and just eat a pizza. I'll just do an extra hour of lifting weights tomorrow. but that is like I've learned only in the last couple of years how ridiculous that is, because you're still doing all that damage to your body. Even if it you can physically, gain some muscle on top of it, you're still damaging your internal organs from all that. So, I mean, if you got to do it, you got to do it, but don't kid yourself into thinking you can just delete it by doing some bench press.
No, it's true. And, there's a section in that chapter now that there's studies that have shown that if you're over 40, there's a certain type of exercise that people over 40 need to do, and people under 40 can just do anything. But the people over 40, they did a huge study. It was 95, a meta-analysis of 95 studies, and they found, and they measured it against all the metabolic markers like A1C, triglycerides, and so on. And they found that for men and women over 40, it was either resistance training or cardio that they were doing. And by far, resistance training came way out in front with all the benefits to the metabolic markers. I'm not saying stop getting off on the treadmill, but don't make that your focus, or getting on one of these machines that you just sit there and you pedal and you're watching TV at a monitor in the gym. No, you got to get
The
familiar with the
advertisements for
machine.
a bunch of seed oil snacks as you're literally on the treadmill.
Exactly. So you got to do the weight training because there's a specific reason for that. There's a section in chapter 9, it's called muscle glucose uptake. And one of the two most fundamental players in the processing of the food that we take in are insulin and glucose, right? Because you eat something, the glucose goes up, the insulin comes in and pushes it down. And that's a healthy, balanced process that goes on. But when you get too much in glucose and you get insulin coming in constantly throughout the day and so forth, you build up a lot of hyperinsulinemia, hyperglycemia, you get too much blood. And what the blood glucose uptake, what that is, or the muscle glucose uptake, it's called, is where the muscles, when you have a certain degree of muscle in your body, that draws in the glucose that's in your blood into the muscles where it doesn't do any harm. In fact, it uses it as energy. So it's called muscle glucose uptake. So the more muscle you have in your body and you're working out, you're pulling out that potentially harmful muscle or blood glucose and pulling it into the muscles where it doesn't do any damage. In fact, it's helpful.
Yeah, I mean, I basically just view cardio as more like of a mental health benefit than a physical health benefit at this point. Because, like, I live close to some forest back in my hometown, and going running around in the forest is so good for you. Just like it fills you with so much good oxygen and good energy, and it really clears you of your free radicals and toxins. But if you're trying to be the healthiest you can be in the long term, I would say like weight training, like lifting weights, is superior to
Yeah, no,
cardio
no,
in
no.
terms of like
It's
pure
wonderful.
health.
What
Not
you're
sure if I
doing
said that
is
exactly
walking in the
right, but
woods,
you know what I mean.
Yeah. No. Walking in the woods, running in the woods, whatever. And a good way to get, if you're over 40 and you're just doing resistance training, what I tell people is to get your cardio in, just do shorter rests in between your sets.
Yeah,
Just
or
instead of,
supersets, doing one after the other if
if
you
you're,
can. Yeah,
if you're used to taking 2 minutes to rest in between, shorten that to 1 or less. And you will be huffing and puffing if you do that. So that's a good way to get your cardio in if you want.
yeah, that's exactly what my dad does. My dad has a little like a weight setup in his garage, and he's 69 right now. He's just shy of 70, and he's doing great. He's in
Perfect.
great shape for his age. He just in there just like
Perfect.
lifting his weights, doing the squats and shoulder press, and like he's killing it. We need more people, like you said, like above 40. But I mean, never stop. There should never be an age where you're like, oh, after this age, you should stop caring about muscle, because it gets more important as you get older.
Yeah, no, exactly. I have a whole section on sarcopenia, which is, the wasting of the muscles. It's this thing that when people get past 50 and they're inactive and their muscles get like soft and all that, and what they need to do and how to solve that. There are certain nutrients they can take too. But I have all that in the book. So that's why I'm just want to get the education out there, because that's what's missing. People don't get this from their doctors. They don't get it from their schools. And that's why I wrote it for the average reader of health and wellness, so that they can they could check that out. But here's the thing for your audience. Go to danieltrevor.com and you can, I have a 7-minute video that tells my story, gives you maybe some shocking information that you've heard in a bit of the past here in this interview with you. And they can also sign up for a free preview of the book, which is basically the first 48 pages of the book. And that way they can get on the mailing list. And because I do mailing like once every week or two, and it's either excerpts from the book or important new information about tests and that kind of thing. And below the video, they can see all these amazing endorsements that I've gotten. It's like, wow, I'm still blown away that I was able to get them. Like what you're talking from Nina Teicholz, from Dr. Ovadia. I got Dr. Mark Hyman, Dr. Eric Berg.
Kate
I even have
Shanahan, who's another seed oil legend we forgot to mention earlier. She's
exactly, yes,
excellent.
Kate Shanahan. I've got Dr. Lou Ignaro, who won the Nobel Prize in Medicine for his discovery of nitric oxide. Whoa. And so on and on like that. And then below all those, I had my web guy mount the interview that I did with Ken Berry. So I put that up there because that went viral. And from that going viral, like
160,000 views as of this morning. I checked it. That's crazy.
really? No
Yeah.
kidding, really. Well, that's what caused the book to go to #1 on Amazon for heart disease, diabetes, and longevity. It's like, what? So, and I'm really tickled by that because I know a lot of people are passing it along to other people. And that's just on YouTube, 162,000 or whatever it is, because it went all over the social media and so forth. So I'm flattered by that. I'm glad people are finding value to it. And again, don't be like me. Follow this. None of this is Daniel's opinion. All the science is there. Check it out. danieltrevor.com.
That's the power of the internet. It gets the good stuff out there. It gets right through the noise. It gets the people's eyeballs and ears so they can actually not guess, test things that work for them. And after reading books like yours, they're going to have a much better tool set of knowing what they should test. And I am constantly pumping the carnivore diet, do it for 30 days. You're going to see a difference. Because
No, definitely.
like this low fat thing is not working for the world or anybody. It's not the way humans are supposed to eat. It's making everyone sick. And by just taking a 30 or like ideally 90-day test of just a high fat diet and go to, after reading Daniel's book, go check out Ken Berry's YouTube channel, Anthony Chaffee's YouTube channel. There's a whole bunch of other, I need to make like a full collection of other books too. But I mean, The Big Fat Surprise, A Deep Nutrition by Kate Shanahan's another good one. There's so many good resources out there that are just going to blow your mind on how deeply you've been tricked your whole life and lead you down a whole new path of finding the best health you've ever had. So I think
true,
that
Ben. Thank you. I'm so happy that you are on this path and you are spreading this word. That thrills me. And big hugs to you for doing that. And thank you so much for having me on. I really appreciate you having me.
You too, Daniel. Trevor, thank you so much for coming by. And I will include every link we mentioned in the show notes. Go check out Daniel's book. It's freaking awesome. And I'll see you later, Daniel, and all my friends listening.